today's presentation is how can we help? How can we, the ordinary person in the street out there, help? And we have a lot of SMEs involved in this group. And obviously, they're very keen to get involved too. But in the end, I think it really does involve all of us. So first of all, I'll just give you a little short background on Peter. Currently, he's the managing director for the Energy Institute in the Asia Pacific. He's based in Singapore, but in addition to his role with EI, he also works as an independent advisor and consultant to a number of international governments and organizations, particularly on subjects like the circular economy. He initially had a long career in the oil and gas industry, but of course, everybody who is in the oil and gas industry now has to transition away sort of from oil and gas and into other things. And that's a good thing. Peter does have some history. He worked out here in the Middle East for quite a number of years. So although he's in Singapore now, he does understand some of the situations we have here. He's a great advocate for the energy sector's need to transition towards cleaner, greener fuels and a cleaner, greener future overall. And so he really, really does love this topic of the circular economy. And I know he's now also moving into getting involved strongly with carbon capture and storage and development of the hydrogen economy, along with refining and the petrochemical sector. So he does have phenomenal background and personal knowledge of how the whole circular economy works or needs to work. So having said that about Peter, I'd like also to introduce Tanya, who's been sort of the backbone of organizing this thing. It was just an idea from me and she jumped on it and has put the whole thing together. Tanya Antonelli Avella, she's actually the founder and managing director of the Goumbook. Let Tanya take over and she will introduce the panel. And then we can go back and let Peter make his presentation. Then we'll come back, the panel will have some discussions, and eventually we'll open up with to Q&As from both the room and the Zoom as we can. Okay, over to you, Tanya.
Yes. Thank you very much, Trevor, for the kind introduction and for introducing Peter, who is our guest speaker today. I'm going to quickly introduce our panel and then I will give back the line to Peter. So today we have here with us to discuss the circular economy situation in the UAE. First of all, Madhu here from Goumbook, Chief of Innovation, and a lot to tell us about what's going on here in the UAE in terms of recycling, but not just recycling, but putting back the resources into the economy. We also have Jamila with us here from the Executive Council Government of Dubai. She's a strategic advisor on sustainable development. And in the past years, a lot is happening also here at policy level, on the ground, related to circular economy. So very happy to have you here today. Thank you. We have also here Riyadh. So Riyadh is a specialist in circular economy related to industry and a very nice point of view to discuss today also and give us his feedback and what is happening from this side. And final but not today. But anyway, today we have Dima as well, specialist in urban development, and very important. And from the small chat we had yesterday, already very interesting question came up related to circular economy, but from a very different point of view, very different than what we're used to, and talking about cities, smart cities, and land. So very excited also to hear about this today as well. So thank you for everyone for being here today. And I would like to give the line back to Peter. We're all very excited to hear more from him. Yesterday during the introduction with the speakers, we were all very excited and we look forward to this presentation. Thank you, Peter.
Okay, thanks, Tatalia. Hello, everybody. Sorry we're starting late. I'm going to try and make my presentation as short as possible, but before we start, when we come back to the panel, could you please make sure that you speak as clearly as you can through the microphones, because the sound that we are hearing on Zoom is not clear. But I would like to make sure that everybody can hear me now. So anybody on Zoom, Can you put your thumbs up if you can hear me? Great, good, very good. The next thing I'm going to ask you when I share my screen is that you can see my slide. So let me get myself up and running on the screen, and then we will take it from there. Can somebody let me know if they can see the slide all right? Yeah, very good. Okay, thank you very much, Trevor. So, welcome. I'm here in Singapore. As Trevor said, I've done a fair amount of work on the circular economy here in the region. I know very well that UAE at the beginning of the year started a policy around the circular economy, which I'll talk about a little bit as well. But my real focus today is to try and pass to you some of the lessons that I've learned about how to become a practitioner in the area of the circular economy, both from the point of view of yourself and from the point of view of society at large, which is really the title of my presentation today. So let me start by saying that the massive impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on lives and economies underscores that our collective survival and well-being hinges on our willingness to confront environmental threats that have global consequences. And the real question that we must all pose, especially as we come out of COVID-19, is this a moment that we can truly pivot, or are we going to carry on as before? Now, history suggests that economic expansions, which we all hope will happen after the COVID-19, don't happen by accident. They happen because leaders in government and business and individuals and families and households all act in a different way. And that creates economic growth and economic boom that will come in the future. And obviously key to protecting our lives and making communities more resilient in that future post-COVID-19 is that we look at different ways of measuring progress, different ways of measuring value, and above all, the buzzword at the moment is creating resilient supply chains, customer demand, supply chains, financial markets, the way we work. Every aspect of business is affected by what we hopefully will see in the future. And encouragingly, most governments and businesses from tech to construction now basically accept that we need to change. So we have the foundation on which to change. Now what we need to do is to enact policies, and that's obviously where the circular economy comes in, but not as a cost, but a means of reducing cost, of optimizing resources, of creating added value, and new products and services and ideas. So I don't look at the circular economy as an extra cost. I look at it as a massive opportunity for the world and society at large to deal with. So that being said, let me move on to my presentation, and let's start by thinking a little bit about where we are today. And obviously, when we start talking about the circular economy, most of us start thinking about resource efficiency and food and waste. And these are natural things that we think about. Why? Because we know there are many people that are hungry. We know that people are really eating nutrient deficient diets that, on the other hand, in other parts of the world, particularly in the rich Western parts of the world, people are obese. They're eating far too much and all the wrong stuff. So we have a problem. We have a mismatch between how we use our resources and effectively how we want to move forwards as we go. And from the point of view of the circular economy, the most important aspect of that is this issue of resource efficiency. And I don't necessarily need to just talk about food. For example, if we look at the oil and gas molecules that come out of the ground and service the world in terms of fuel, actually only 38% or less of those molecules turns into useful energy. The rest of those molecules actually get spent on the way to the customer. So we're using that money to actually dig out the molecules, transport the molecules, refine the molecules, and eventually they get to the supply chain. So the bottom line is that the way we use resources and the way supply chains are managed needs to change, and change dramatically, whichever way you look at it. And of course, on the other side of the coin is the fact that when we look at waste and we look at the way we use resources, we end up with stuff that frankly ought to be going into other people's use and not to become health hazards for the rest of the world. But looking at that from the point of view of the circular economy, we got to remember that it's not just about food and waste. There is a need to actually fundamentally change the way we think about the way we use resources and manage resources and our role within that and the role of society as a whole. And as I mentioned before, the UAE has started to develop a circular economy around a number of key themes, 5+1 key themes being green infrastructure, sustainable transport, sustainable manufacturing, sustainable food production and consumption, and other areas such as technology, innovation, and R&D. So that's where effectively the UAE has started its journey, and it's only the start of a journey with regards to where the circular economy can go and will go in the future. So with that in mind, let me talk a little bit about Singapore. And Singapore is where I've done a lot of work in recent years, looking at developing Singapore's circular economy strategy. And that, of course, looks at a completely different set of concepts, not just at infrastructure, transport, manufacturing, food production, consumption, technology, innovation, and R&D. Those were kind of the things we thought about a few years ago. Now what we're beginning to start doing is trying to look at it from the point of view of processes. And what you will see on this, and you can look at this online, I mean, there's a little thing that if you use your, on the side there, that on the right-hand side, you'll see the little black and white symbol. If you want to use your mobile phones, you can take a photo of it and that will take you to the website where you can see more information on Singapore's Green Plan. You will see that on this slide, we're talking about some fundamental areas where we are beginning to start seeing a different way of working. A city of nature, i.e. we want to create an environment that is natural and beautiful. We want to have a government that works in a way, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we come on when we start talking about green procurement, in a way that is connected so that it's everything that we do at government level, at policy level, has a green or sustainable element connected to it. We're looking at ways of looking at sustainability from an overall living concept. So this is not only from the point of view of individuals, but citizens, commuters, schools, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we're already beginning to start looking at a whole range of issues around it. And in the area of mobility, obviously, we're looking at what we're calling the energy reset, which is effectively not only EVs and mobility, but looking at how we develop greener infrastructure. In fact, earlier today, I was speaking at an event on green infrastructure and buildings, on sustainable towns and districts and how we manage them. And we talked yesterday a little bit about land management, which we may want to talk a little bit more about later on. And overall, how that green energy market can be developed to the benefit of Singapore, not to the cost, but to the benefit of Singapore going forwards. Likewise, we're looking at a whole set of new economic and financial engines that will drive a more carbon efficient means of trading, not only energy, but everything that we trade here in Singapore. And finally, of course, the whole issue of resilience that I mentioned before as being key. So some major topics. Now, what underpins those, and so now going into a little bit more detail. So I'm now going to talk about some of the slides that I've used to basically take us down that journey, to create that slide that I just showed you now. Where we started off from was a very obvious statement, which is saying that at the end of the day, when we look at market economics today, we look at financial value. We look at financial metrics as we understand them today. In the future, we recognize that environmental and social values will have to play a much bigger role in the way we work. So the way we value values must change. And that is what true value is all about. And the way we do that is by creating a system that will allow us to create, deliver, sustain, design everything in an integrated value chain that allows us to basically begin to start working within that context. And so I'm going to talk about 4 key elements of that, which all relate to the circular economy, starting with the circular economy as a principle, but then boiling down into 3 other areas where we in Singapore are beginning to do quite a lot of work in terms of the toolbox, in terms of the things we're looking at. So I mentioned earlier on government trying to become more joined up. Well, government are just about, in fact, they've just released a press release here in Singapore on the fact that we're about to have a green procurement policy. Now, what that means is that anything that is not green or sustainable in time will be taxed, not just carbon, but everything that is non-circular will have a cost to it. So for example, Singapore's looking at solar cells and solar as being a major part of its energy mix going forwards on buildings. But some of the solar cells have a very high lead content and therefore are very difficult to deal with from a resource efficiency and a waste to value perspective. And those will be taxed higher than solar cells that are made with more renewable and structured materials. And that will go for everything in the future. So government have made a policy or are making a policy that will take those things into account. Likewise, we're looking at waste. We're looking at integrated waste, not only from the point of view of where we were a few years ago, which was waste to energy. Everything was incinerated in Singapore, so we didn't throw waste away, we burnt it and made energy out of it. Now we're more interested in saying, what else can we do with that waste? How do we turn it into value in addition to just energy? And all of that boils down to this concept of systems thinking that I've tried to mention when I was showing that green plan that Singapore has and is continuing to develop as we move forwards. So let me start with the circular economy. The first thing is one needs to obviously prioritize renewable inputs. One needs to actually begin to start looking at how to maximize the use and functionality of products and services. And finally, one needs to find ways of recovering excess byproducts and turning them into value. Those 3 underlying principles are really the core to developing any part of the circular economy wherever we look. And within that context, and this is the slide, I guess, that sold me to the Singapore government as an advisor. So I'm going to show it to you because this is what actually got some of the civil servants excited in Singapore and started the conversation. And I started off by saying, what is sustainability? And I think most of you will have seen this. It comes out of the United Nations. But where we start from is the 3 Ps: people, planet, and profit. And sustainability was all about trying to find the interface between economics, the environment, as we discussed in terms of value, and social variables, and make sure that effectively everything that we're doing is viable, equitable, and bearable. Some of you will have heard of the energy trilemma, which is not dissimilar to this, which is all about security, value, and sustainability as well. So it's a very similar model to the way the energy industry would look at the energy trilemma. But where we got to from this was the next step of sustainability was to say, well, actually, when you start looking at energy, when you start looking at food, when you start looking at water, when you start looking at waste, perhaps these things are not in themselves separate businesses anymore. Perhaps we need to look at the whole way we manage that people, planet, profit system from a much more systemic approach and recognize that energy, food, water, and waste actually have more in common than we think they have. For example, an example that I had a big argument with our power people here. They said, well, obviously power is very different to energy, as very different to water. And then the water guy said, well, actually, if we laid down our water pipes and our power pipes or power pipelines or power transmission lines and distributed lines at the same time, we could actually probably save around 30% of our costs. Suddenly the penny dropped. Aha, there's a need to actually begin to start looking at the way industry is managed in very different ways. And this then led to the third and final diagram on this slide, which I think is the interesting one, which is to say that sustainability is not just about any one particular value chain as we know them before, beginning to work separately. It's about evolving a whole new set of ecosystems and how they work. And what we developed here were a number of different areas that, if you like, were the basis of that green plan that I just showed you earlier. We talked about society, we talked about the quality of life, we talked about environment, we talked about government, we talked about economy, we talked about mobility. But we looked at them from the point of view of saying, well, if you look at them, you begin to start looking at subsystems or ecosystems that all have to be managed in different ways going forwards. Culture and well-being, health and safety and security, resource management. I won't go through all of them. But suddenly the penny dropped and we began to start looking at the world from a systemic point of view and began to start developing circularity in different ways. Now, interestingly enough, let me put a little bit of a pause on my conversation and take you to another reference point. Again, if you take your telephones, you can take a picture of the blue diagram on the right, and that will take you to the well site, to this particular site. But I'd like to talk about an initiative that was started by the Prince of Wales about 2 years ago. It's still actually not well publicized, called Terra Carta, which some of you might have heard about. But interestingly enough, this group of businesses and institutions, including the Energy Institute, have been working on a 10-point action plan that, if you like, underpins the ecosystems that I was just talking about on the previous slide. Those being the fact that we need to not just look at metrics and standards and sustainability and subsidies, but we need to look at all of these 10 issues as part of the fix of how we create a circular economy. And I'll just quickly run through them. Default settings means shifting our default settings to sustainability. Everything is sustainable and all our business models should be put that way. Pathways means outlining responsible transition pathways, by which we mean creating new value chains and creating new pathways to getting there. 3, developing and reimagining markets so that they're much more sustainable than they have been before. 4, identifying game-changing technologies and emerging solutions, but not as individual technologies, as technology ecosystems that can make a difference in the future. So another point I'll make here is Singapore has realized it's not all about coming up with high-tech, new tech, fintech. It's actually about how do we integrate fintech, new tech, and other techs into the ecosystems of the future. Integrated systems is what we need to think about. Number 5 is making sure that we don't put subsidies, incentives into the wrong places. Number 6 is about making sure that we're investing in the right R&D for sustainable solutions and alternative industries and industry ecosystems. Number 7, which you'd expect to see there from a Prince of Wales point of view, is not to forget about nature and investing in nature, which is the true engine of the economy. And then numbers 8, standards are pretty obvious, communicating and socializing that. And finally, developing a whole set of new platforms on which to base investments going forward. So 10 key points that underpin that picture on the right-hand side that I showed you previously. Now, those things are looking at the macro level. What I now want to do is to sort of move down and say, underlying all of those principles are effectively some circular concepts that I'd like to just discuss with you. And where we start from is manufacturing, right the way from primary materials and resources, right the way through to value leakage and waste at the end. And what I'd like to talk to you just very, very quickly about are the processes that make that work, okay, from a circular point of view. Firstly, primary materials and resources need to be sourced in a circular way. They need to be worked out on the basis of sustainable design, resource efficiency, and product as a service, as opposed to necessarily using product. So a good example of product as a service is BMW, for example, has now launched a whole initiative to say, and they believe that in the future, nobody will own a car anymore. What BMW will have to do is to create a BMW N series, which you will call up on your app and it will arrive. And it won't necessarily be your car, but it will be a BMW N series in perfect condition that will take you to where you want to go. And that's a very different way of looking at a mobile product. And they are looking at those sorts of products and services as the way they will manage their future. So those are all very, very important concepts that we need to consider. And then when we look at the backside of this value chain, there are various things that we can do in terms of making sure that there is no value leakage. And that's about appropriately creating sharing and virtualizing services in the case of car sharing, for example, optimizing and maintenance, reusing, refurbishing, recycling, et cetera, et cetera. And all of those things are effectively linked into what then becomes the circular economy from both a production and a consumption perspective. So again, I think that kind of toolbox is useful, whatever business one is looking at, whether it be oil and gas, managing a widget, plastics, or any other form of product. Within this context, I'm just showing you an example here of an engineering contractor, oil and gas, that we've been working on recently here in Singapore. And as you can see, they've taken this kind of circularity approach and begun to start developing their own system around saying, how do we actually create a virtual system within the context of the circular economy? And they too have come up with a very similar diagram that looks at design, looks at other material extraction processes, how they can be manufactured. And this is real life work that one of my clients has been looking at here, one of the major contractors, closing the loop as we call it. So if we look at the oil and gas business, which is of course my area, we all know that the oil and gas business is shifting dramatically. Whether you're BP, whether you're Dubai Petroleum Company, whether you're ADNOC, whether you're ExxonMobil, we all know that the world of energy is changing, both from the point of view of renewables, but most importantly from the point of view of supply and demand. Gone are the days where the energy industry that was invented at the major industrial revolution over 100 years ago was all set around global resources, global demand, global supply, and it was a very linear picture. Oil companies produce, individuals use, and there may be a long distance between the two, but it doesn't matter because everybody's making money. Thank you very much. Now, in tomorrow's world, energy is going to be much more localized. Solar can be developed locally. Wind power in the right place can be developed locally. Geothermal can be developed locally. You're not going to sell that stuff, you're going to use it locally. So the bottom line is this linear supply chain of the past is dead and new supply chains are developed. And guess what? I'll show you an example here that DNV have been working on, a little bit complicated, but you now begin to start seeing those supply chains in a very different way. Fossil fuel extraction, you're seeing a whole set of new energy meshes developing as the green circle. You're seeing a whole new set of systems working for transportation. You can see buildings, you can see carbon capture and storage coming into play. You can see all of those things. And guess what? You've got Shell and BP and ExxonMobil beginning to say, how do we play in this new game? How do we begin to start developing a strategy that looks like this? Not the old linear model of the past, but something that looks more akin to this in terms of energy ecosystems going forwards. So enough said about circularity and ecosystems. Let's quickly move on to green procurement, another area that the Singapore government is working on. Here we see a completely new way of looking at not only government policy, but a policy that the government has committed to saying, we're going to try this first. We're going to have a green procurement policy in place for everything we purchase. And once we've worked it at the government level, we will work it through the business level and the individual level. So government is taking the lead to develop a very clear green procurement policy aimed at looking at new ways of managing not only the circular economy, but the social benefits of green procurement, innovative products, management information, and everything else that is linked into this. And what's working behind that is something that I've already talked about earlier on, resource efficiency and material efficiency, making sure that we're maximizing life where we can and reusing where we can, and using obviously renewable resources even better. But above all, examining them from a systems level thinking perspective. So we come back to this concept of systems level thinking and the circular economy underpinning all of that. And that's all I'm going to say on green procurement before I move back to waste. And most of you will have seen this. But again, finally, and most people start with waste when you talk about circular economy, let me just say a few words about waste. Obviously, we're all trying to minimize waste, avoid waste, create waste to value. Circular economy is making sure that we actually co-process and maximize the upper part of this waste hierarchy. And again, that links very closely into what I've been saying about circularity, systems thinking, and the waste hierarchy. But the bit that, again, Singapore is beginning to work on with companies like Veolia and other waste management companies, including the oil and gas industry, I might say, in terms of refining and petrochemicals, is what we are calling reverse logistics. The major barrier to actually doing something with waste is the fact that somehow you've got to turn that waste into value. And that means creating a value chain that looks at the red squares rather than the blue squares. So how do we create effectively the circularity of not only providing a product through from supplier to waste, but taking the waste away and returning it into a system that actually is value adding and value creating. Interestingly enough, we're beginning to see that the same value chain owners of the forward logistics have an interest in getting involved in the value chain ownership of reverse logistics. And that's, again, a very interesting tool that we see that can be developed in the future. So systems thinking, finally, and let me just talk about that. You all presumably know about the concept of systems. I've tried to explain ecosystems. In terms of two quick toolboxes before I finish, very quickly, that are worth thinking about. One of them is this so-called iron triangle, the fact that everything we do boils down to doing things on time, to a particular scope and to a particular cost. And for example, whenever you look at doing something quickly with low cost, you know, you're going to end up with a problem. So it'll be low cost equals quick and low quality. If it's done quickly and high quality, then it's fast and good. So again, this is a model that helps you value what a system ought to look like and how it is managed appropriately. And then finally, a set of systems mapping tools that, again, I found useful when discussing individual processes as we move forwards. So that, in simple terms, is what we're all about. In whether you're an SME, whether you're a large company, you can begin to start mapping your own circular opportunities. You can be clear about creating your own circular economy strategy and vision based on some of the things that I've discussed already, and mapping out a transformation route that works. And my belief is that if you don't do that and move before your competitors and customers and regulators do, you will miss the boat. So interestingly enough, my alternative title for this presentation was Disrupt or Be Disrupted, rather than Society versus Self, or Self versus Society. Let me finish off by saying one last thing, which is when we look at the trends that are going to move us forwards, these are the big issues that we need to think about that overpin everything that we've just discussed over the last minutes. The environment is clearly going to be an increasing focus, with resource efficiency being there. Climate change, but recognizing that there is not one green solution. There are many shades of green depending on where you are, what your resources are. And that's something that I don't think people understand yet. There is no single one size fits all. Likewise, in my opinion, there is no such thing as a single price of carbon. And I'm happy to discuss that more in the panel. Innovation, but focused on systems integration rather than individual solutions. Changing consumer behavior, restructuring our portfolios accordingly and our supply chains. And of course, finally, resilience means that things will change in the world of healthcare in particular and air travel, but I'll leave that for the panel to discuss. I'll leave you there. Thank you very much. I've been as quick as I can. I hope I've given you some useful input. Thank you.
So we often think of circular economy in terms of production, manufacturing, waste, energy, water, and different systems. But when it comes to looking at it from a city level, I think there's something missing. It's still in its pregnancy stage, I think, and not even pregnancy stage. So if you think of the city as a living organism, there's a concept called urban metabolism, and it's where the city uses its resources to produce energy. And that living organism has the cells, and the cells are the land uses, which provides the canvas for everything else to happen, for all the functions to happen. So I see a missing link in all circular economy conversations, that the land use system isn't really considered. And as an urban planner, I can tell you that the same concept that we apply to single-use plastics is applied to land use as well. There's single use in land use, and that is a detriment to sustainability. And I think the first step to move towards circular economy is to consider mixed use and multiple use. And we have been calling for this for a long time, all urban planners who care about the environment. But then I think what's happening recently in terms of innovation and circular economy is even pushing this forward and towards a multi-layered mixed use, not just a mixed use within one neighborhood and district, but within the same plot and between plots. So we are looking at creating multi-layered land uses to allow for different uses to happen. And unfortunately, what I see is that we have a land use system that we've inherited in generations that is very rigid, and it doesn't support that. And one of the examples I'm going to give is, I was in Amsterdam just before COVID, was visiting urban farms, and they were actually complaining that the city doesn't allow urban farms to take place within the city, because the traditional thinking is about having rural farms and then urban areas and neighborhoods. So for us to move into a circular economy that calls for regenerative agriculture, we need to allow the farms to come into the city, I think. That's just one of the examples. Other examples are the co-location of facilities. So if we're looking at reusing the waste from one process into something else, then they need to be co-located in a way that allows that function to happen. So I think there's a big discussion about the land use system and the land management system that needs to take place for the circular economy to happen at a manufacturing level. And I'm very familiar with Singapore, and they are very, very limited when it comes to land because it's an island. So they have a very compact model in terms of land use, and it's been very successful. That is benchmarked across the world. So I'd like to ask you, after this long introduction, are there any land use strategies that the Urban Redevelopment Authority is considering to allow circular economy to happen at an amplified level?
Good. Very good question again. And obviously, there are two things I would say. Firstly, yes, is a very simple answer to your question. the Singapore government is looking at the whole issue of land use from a number of different perspectives. But I guess the one government perspective is the most important one, a recognition number one, that when you look at land use and land planning in the past, as you rightly say, it has been fixed by a whole set of planning conditions that are archaic and rather protectionist in terms of the way they apply. And obviously you need to break those hierarchical systems that were in place and have been in place for a large time. So it requires a whole rethinking of the way that ministries and planning permissions are basically adapted. So what Singapore's done is it hasn't basically gone right and say, right, we need to change everything all overnight. What Singapore is increasingly doing is looking at the island from a zonal perspective. So we're looking at zones where we can try different forms of multi-utilization. So for example, Singapore is in the business of relocating its port, which is a massive, massive undertaking. You know, Singapore is the biggest port in Southeast Asia, and they're relocating the whole thing because they recognize that the port is, number one, encroaching upon land that could be better used for manufacturing, for hotels, for residential purposes, and to create a resort. And they're moving a port to the northwest, which is more industrial and more appropriate to develop an industrial zone and a manufacturing zone. So again, lots of things are being done to move things together. Another very simple example, talking about nature, is that, you know, Singapore's famous for its botanic gardens, for its bird park, and for its zoos, which is trying to become the best in the world. Guess what? People are beginning to now say, well, actually, certainly the bird park and the zoo ought to be co-located. Actually, having the bird park somewhere completely separate from the zoo makes no sense. Number one, it's costing more environment, and it's costing more in terms of food and upkeep, and it doesn't optimize the way we're using the environmental land. So again, what we're tending to do is to come up with a zonal strategy for multiple use of land, but that then requires ministries such as the Ministry of Transport, such as the Labour Ministry, such as the Housing Ministry, such as obviously those that are developing the environment and nature, to work together in order to come to an alternative, a zonal strategy and zonal solution to the problem. So that's number one. The other thing that Singapore's spending a lot of money in is looking at what we're calling multi-layer surveying of land, which means everything from satellite to subsurface. In other words, we don't actually have that much practical mapping yet. The Ordnance Survey in the UK is beginning to do more work that actually overlays everything from the air right the way down to the subsurface, to geology, in a way that allows us to optimize the way we use resources, water reservoirs, potentially, you know, places where we can put waste as well in the future, and all of those sorts of issues. So again, we're looking at that. And then the final area we're looking at, being an island, is we're looking at offshore and innovating around, a bit like Amsterdam has been doing, as you mentioned, around offshore structures, offshore solar, and the use of coastal areas, not only from the point of view of building structures, but also adding value by making those coastal defenses at the same time as building structures, because seawater is likely to rise with global warming. So there are a number of multi-dimensional issues at work around how land needs to be managed that, frankly, historically have not been thought about before. And that is the core of where circular economy needs to go in terms of land management. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you. Very clear. But like you said, we have a bigger job on our shoulders because we've inherited this archaic land system that we need to adapt to circular economy.
finish one other point. Another area, again, having spent some time in the Gulf, that I believe ought to be looked at is coastal work, because actually I think the Gulf lends itself to quite a lot of coastal opportunity, not only from the point of view of looking at, you know, resorts and, you know, sort of more of those things, but use of the coast for a lot more activity in the future.
Yes, thank you, Dima, for this question. And we've learned a lot also about Singapore. It would be interesting to apply all this to Dubai and the UAE and how we're using the land here. Maybe we could have another event involving land department. It would be interesting. You've touched upon very interesting topics, Peter, and maybe I'll ask you a couple of questions later, but I don't know if Jamila or Riyad have any question?
Okay, so thank you. I just go on what Dima was talking about this relocation. I just want to illustrate exactly the UAE happened in the industry of logistics and issue of waste transportation. And then I add two other points which somehow illustrate what Peter was talking about, you know, the benefits of having this circular economy. So the first point, which is related to relocation or location of existing facilities. I was in the past years in a cement factory, working on the division called Geocycle. Basically, the target was to collect waste from different industries, treating it, and then using it as a raw material or fuel instead of fossil fuel or natural resources. The problem is when you look at the map of UAE, is that most of the waste is in Abu Dhabi, Dubai. Most of the cement plants are in the northern Emirates, which is like 500 kilometers away. We have definitely an issue of, you know, trying to solve the issue of how do I take care of the waste in an efficient manner or environmentally friendly way. Obviously, you cannot move the cement plants. It's costly. One of the solutions is also to help industries such as cement players to allow the transportation of waste. And for years and years, I'm sure Madhu knows this very well, the permitting through going from one emirate to another emirate for different commodities, including waste, was difficult to get. So it was not really helping. So I think on the regulation side, that's one point that needs to be addressed in terms of we want to have a circular economy, but we're not giving the means to do it. The other side is costs, which is somehow, okay, I'm going to try to solve an issue which is in Abu Dhabi using a facility in Fujairah, but it's a global country issue that we need to solve. Why are you putting taxes on waste, which is somehow going to be disposed in a friendly way and not being sent to landfill? So again, regulation-wise, there's a lot of things that we've been discussing in the past years with BOCA and municipalities to try to convince them. And I think it's moving slowly in this direction, because we've seen lately on what we call RDF project, which is basically waste coming from municipal solid waste that we transfer into non-organic and use it for cement factories. It's simple technically. They have allowed for this kind of waste not to be taxed, not to be considered as waste, although it's coming from waste. So we see now that there have been conscious about the fact that we need to help and we need to incentivize the movement of waste from Emirates to other Emirates so that we can really solve the issue. That was related to the other 2 points, which I think you mentioned in your presentation, very nice, that the benefit of circular economy has 3 folds. One is the financial, the environment, and the social. And just to illustrate what we have done, for instance, in the cement industry, we were collecting this waste not for the sake of having a nice green picture on the website, but because it was making reduction in cost. It's a cost-saving activity because you're basically not using fossil fuel, which has a high cost, or usually coal here in UAE. You're using waste, which you are retreating, and at the end you're making a large savings for the company. So that's the first one. It does really happen. So people usually think, yeah, we're going to be spending more money in using other types of material, but in fact it's making money. So that's the first point. The second is definitely you're not using natural resources or fossil fuel. So you're reducing your CO2 footprint, obviously, and you're avoiding products to go to the landfill, which is, as everybody knows, increasing the CO2 impact. And the last, in some countries, not especially here, but we've seen this in the group that was working in Africa, you are building some kind of a network with the local communities. There was example, for instance, in Uganda, I think, where we were helping farmers who were harvesting coffee to collect the waste from them, to invest in some tools and equipment to help them harvest. And then we were collecting the waste and then use it as a fuel because the calorific value of waste from coffee was interesting for cement. So it also helps somehow build this kind of community and social links between the producer and the consumer. Just wanted to display this live example that we have here. Thanks, Peter.
Yeah, so thanks for that, and basically go along with everything you say. Singapore is going in a very similar way, looking at effectively how waste can be used for advanced building materials. How obviously cement can be either reused or remanufactured in some way to be used as well. So clearly there's, I think, potentially quite a lot of cooperation that Singapore and UAE could have in this sort of space. But let's just talk a little bit about the value chain piece, because right at the beginning you talked about this issue of distance, which comes back to what I was trying to say about this reverse value chain, is that, the trick is to recognize, as you rightly say, that, this is not going to come for free to start with. The government is going to have to subsidize or reduce tax. But as we all know, what we don't want is a government that is putting subsidies and tax in there for the long term. It can do it for a short period in order to effectively get the circular economy moving. But once that's there, then the government has to be able to walk away and say, right, now the value chain is developed. So this is the importance of this idea of developing the forward logistics and reverse logistics chains appropriately. And this also boils down to the point about land management, because, if there is a great distance and it doesn't work because supply and demand are so far away from each other, then over time, one has to find a way of rezoning that will sort that problem out as well, as part of the solution. So all of these things are linked again, in my opinion, and that's all I'm going to say. I agree with everything you said. I think that the cement industry is doing a very good job in terms of looking at what it can do within the construction area. Interestingly enough, here in Singapore and on Jurong Island, the refining and petrochemicals industries are doing similar types of activities around waste to value, recognizing that actually maybe refining and petrochemical sites not only will move into biofuels, but have the potential to actually manufacture a lot of stuff that traditionally has never been managed on a refinery site before or on a petrochemical site before. So people are beginning to start looking at very different ways of developing those ecosystems of the future.
So I think it's actually very useful today to talk about Singapore and what Singapore is doing. I remember 10 years ago going to an event organized by the Goumbook Talk here in Dubai, and we were talking about renewable energies. And at that time, they were looking at how Singapore had already organized the grid and allowed people to install panels and connect to the grid and get money back or put their energy into the grid. 10 years ago, Dubai was looking at Singapore as an example to follow, and hopefully, looking at the plan, the green plan, it looks quite similar to what Dubai has announced as the Dubai 2040 plan, a much greener city, like 60% of land being green and parks and trees. I would love, and we've been talking about, a lot today about the role of the government, ministries coming together, subsidies, taxes. So I think it would be interesting to understand also from Jamila's point of view. I don't know if you want to talk about this, but I'm sure between all of us, you are the ones with the more insights about what's going on and what is the plan for Dubai and the UAE.
I'll actually link back to Nima's question and Peter's answer before. I think there's a lot of expectation on governments moving and entering trendsetters. And actually, circular economy, I think if we go back
in history, the industries have been the leaders in looking, they want to minimize costs and maximize profits, right? So the more efficient they can be in resources, the better for their bottom line. And so, I mean, oil and gas is famous for it, but a lot of other industrial sectors are also very, very proficient. And I think the more complex our cities are becoming, the more we need to be given hints. And so if I just go back to the land management issue, in my previous role as a consultant, we have inherited a bit of rigid systems, land management systems in the region globally. But one specific developer, actually managed to get non-business as usual approvals for their project because they had a master plan project and they took the guarantee not to comply with the government requirements. This is very difficult and very rare to have. It's very rare to have actually in this region we do have mega developers, but the government can't set rules that are very innovative without the buy-in of the actual developers who own the land, who bought the land based on a specific business case, and then they're told, oh, by the way, your parking is going to be slashed by 50%. They're going to worry about people who want to rent. They're going to worry about commercial businesses who won't invest or rent the spaces, etc. And so, but because that specific developer guaranteed that they're willing to take the risk, there are several non-business as usual approvals that happened in transportation mode shares. So they exceeded by far like the public transportation segment of that given project. In terms of utilities, energy and water consumption, they went much lower than the business as usual or the minimum required by DiAM, etc., because they took this on board. And if I transition to other sectors, I mean, you're well aware of the Circle Coalition, is it? Where businesses are putting the business case to government to say this is the business case. And I think COVID is very helpful for circular economy because governments are tight on budgets and they want businesses to stand on their feet with minimum subsidies from their side. So if the sector coalesces and says, you're going to help me by adjusting this policy, I think you have more than ever open ears. And then the formation of the Circular Economy Council is testament to that at the federal level. I don't think they have a clear set detailed action plan. It's still in progress. I mean, a lot of business partners have reviewed the policy. This is just testament that there is now a much bigger dialogue, which is essential. And I think our region is lagging behind in terms of public-private discussions. You know, I mean, in Copenhagen, they have the Danish industry, which represents 1,000 businesses that sit on table with policymakers to say this is what we need to change, etc. So I think we're moving definitely in the right direction. Dubai has launched its 2040 plan, which is people-centric. I won't say it's, I mean, it's trying to address gaps that you had addressed previously. DiAM will be launching probably like a public version soon, so I can't necessarily like disclose the details, but it is, I mean, the aim is to reduce dependency on private vehicles, to maximize protection of the natural environment, minimize overall carbon footprint, and then the announcements for improved NDCs in terms of climate change commitment globally are also reflecting that the UAE doesn't just want to hide behind its minimum requirements globally because it's not required actually to minimize its carbon emissions really like to the level that was publicized. And so there is definitely an intent to go forward. I won't go. Do you want me to address any?
I think that's a lot of questions.
One point, Jamila, you know, another sort of maybe help, I don't know. I'm not sure if UAE has anything similar, but Singapore about a year and a half ago, which also led to quite a lot of assistance around getting the green plan up and running, launched a thing called the Emerging Stronger Together Task Force. Again, you can look at that online, but what that was trying to do was exactly what you said, which was to bring together senior officials from government, business, society, NGOs, and everybody together to come up with an aligned vision around some of these issues that we've just discussed now. So if you like, it was a task force that was basically made of the great and the good from all parts of society that are acting as a think tank, if you like, as an advisory committee to government on policy change. Now, I don't think I'm not sure if UAE has anything similar, but that may be a way to overcome or at least accelerate some of the initiatives that you basically talked about.
Can I just add one thing? Sorry, the Circular Economy Council, I think, is trying to play that role. But for example, the Dubai Chamber of Commerce has a lot of business groups that bring together private sector with public. I don't know if it's as extensive and far-reaching into different sectors as Singapore, but there is definitely that open dialogue. The second point I wanted to highlight about Singapore, which is very beneficial, is they also have a green finance plan, and the objective is for Singapore to become a green finance capital in terms of positioning it in the financial market. But what this does is provide green financing mechanisms even for local businesses. And I think we still haven't tapped into that locally to open up, the green financing channels for the SMEs, the startups, the social businesses, etc. So yeah, that's also.
There's also another point that you mentioned earlier related to Singapore, and it's the use of water. And there is something I would like to ask you, because it's kind of an urban legend that goes around, and I would like to know if it's true. Do you actually treat your water and filter it and then drink it, and bottle it? So yes. So basically, the water goes around Singapore. Circular economy. Great. Because this is something we're trying to promote here in the UAE, is to actually filter water and drink it instead of having to use single-use packaging for it. But I don't know if the panelists appreciated today the water that is next to them, and it's packaged in aluminum cans. So they've been drinking water in aluminum cans, and I would like to have your opinion, and maybe also Matt, who can help us, about the state of the recycling for aluminium, and if aluminium can be considered a material that can grow as packaging rather than plastic.
To be honest, I'm not an expert in the area of aluminium and its treatment with relationship to water, or whether aluminium makes a good packaging or not. I mean, I know there are issues around aluminium, but I also know that aluminium can be recycled, but has some issues. So to me, I'm not a scientist, but I will just say something about water, which is, yes, we are continuing to develop a whole set of activities around water process management. And interestingly enough, it's not only water, in that we are now just about to commission what we're calling the TUAS Nexus plant, which is not only a water processing facility, but it's also a waste processing facility. So actually, water, waste, and bringing those two things together within the context of circular economy are not beyond the realms of possibility. So next year, people will be able to come and visit this plant. It's quite incredible. Likewise, we have a water processing facility that was a sewer system in the new Botanic Gardens, in the Gardens by the Bay area, again, which is a remarkable piece of engineering that basically turns sewage water into water quality bottled water. So your rumors are 100% correct, and it is amazing. That's what we do.
It is amazing. It is amazing. I mean, this is the way to safeguard a very precious resource, especially here in the UAE, where water is very scarce. I can see this comment by Viridiana Bayo. To have an idea, we need a life cycle assessment of aluminium can and the plastic bottle. True. And we're actually working on that. I would like to ask Matt to give us a bit more insights on what is being recycled here in the UAE. another bomb questions for you.
Thank you. Just to take it from whatever has been discussed earlier. Now, I have been in the UAE from 1997 and basically associated like Abu Dhabi and Dubai. And if I really notice growth in the past years, it's phenomenal. But definitely, Peter, you remember you were mentioning about your times here and see currently what is happening on the ground. There's a lot of change. Just to give an example, earlier, especially because again that was more from the oil and gas sector. I was involved with this company. What is happening is all the private sector was taking so with enthusiasts who are willing to do something and with the support. And we had in fact done one of the first oil refiner, which means the waste oil used to be going from all over the place with misused stuff. So we set up the first, was the first EPP facility way back in 2006, 7, still running. Now that it's called oil. Similarly, we had cleaned up more than about 40,000 tons of sludge, which was lying in at NOC in those areas, using specific technology, when doing bioremediation. So a lot of work which was being done in the private sector, but it was basically based on the interest of the specific company which was planning it. Unfortunately, I was associated. And of course, now for the past 7 years, I've been 5 at Dalsco. And this is where I've really seen a major shift in the entire thought process. Because if you look at companies like Dalsco, we have been in this field and as a local company 5 years, and as a waste management company, we have been 23. But waste management in this part of the world is primarily transporting, taking waste from point A and dumping it, nothing. There was not even proper landfill. So from that to where we are today, we have come along. I can give an example because when I moved into Dalsco, we were basically we were looking at then at how do you add value. This is where companies like us, to give an example, look at UAE alone. The per capita generation of waste is one of the highest. We generate about 2.3 kgs per person on an average. If you look at Dubai, because we see the waste on a daily basis, we realize that there's a huge value in it. So we are looking at how do we do something on that. So for example, in Dubai, telling you on an average, we generate about 6,000 tons of municipal solid per day. Per day. So that's a type of waste. And out of that, if you look at it, more than 45% around that are recycled, which could be reckoned. Then you have some amount of food waste. And if you're looking at overall waste in the way, what we also realized was more than 50% when you take the per capita is construction and demolition. And you'll be surprised if I tell you Dubai dumps more than 10,000, 15,000 tons of CO2 waste on a daily basis. That's of course Abu Dhabi also generates. Now in a minute, does something. So what we did was about 3 years back. That is where we realized governmental support is also coming in because there's a lot of awareness. We discussed with the Ministry of Environment. And along with the ministry, we set up a system because again, all this, and one of the biggest challenges, especially unlike in Singapore, in the UAE, is that there is no concept like the polluter pays. There is absolutely no charge for the waste generated. If I throw this waste on the bin, my job is done. I'm not charged a bin. For example, can you imagine companies like us? We are collecting waste, we are transporting waste, and it is being dumped in the municipal, for example, dump yard. Just at 10 dirhams truck. Whether I carry 5 tons, 40 tons, it's the same. So 10 dirhams. Okay. So whereas per ton how much it is being charged in any other part of the world. So for somebody to invest on systems and technologies to process this, either the government has to pay or the industry has to. The industry has to pay. Then, for example, tipping fees has to be, and that is where, of course, we have been having all our discussions with ministry and government. And definitely that will come in because that is what would encourage people like us to invest more. Respect of that, for example, in the C&D side, what we managed was with the ministry, they agreed for a specific thing. Plus, they also said, okay, we give you a concession for it. And we succeeded in setting up all the Northern Emirates, all the 4 Emirates we were supposed to set up. But of course, finally, we ended up setting up 2 Emirates, Ajman and Oman. Today, 100% of the CMD waste there is completely recycled. And another thing is that you can imagine on an average day, as we talk, we are handling about 20,000 tons per month or more of products from this sort of. This has given a lot of, factors. The whole thing of, for example, look at, if you look at the aggregates, which is coming up, which this country needs. The only place where they could get it is in Fiji, those hills. The moment the destruction of the hills is over, it's finished. There's nothing inside. So we have managed to reduce a lot of destruction of the hills. We managed to reduce, for example, a lot of these diesel-operated crushers will be there. Then their operations have come down because we are operating on power, our crushers. So there is, and this has really paved a lot of way. And now the government last year, ministry has come up with circular, but they're allowing industry to use almost 40% of the recycling construction waste in the construction. So this is the type of incentivization or support which the government is giving to encourage people like us to come. Then another example, for example, what has happened now is until about 2014, there has been absolutely waste segregation. Anyway, everything was going into the land, say 20-40%. So the municipalities brought in companies like us, ourselves, we have private companies, and they came up with a program called My City. The whole challenge was to see that okay, they removed municipality bins, and then we came in and placed a two-bin system where we asked people to start putting recyclables in one, other general waste in one, and then we were collecting recyclables, trying to sort it. And we've been running a lot of campaigns, education campaigns to market. And if you really look at it from that perspective, from let's say 0% recycling of recycling from MSW stream, today the municipality with the support of private sector has achieved almost 20%, which is quite good. We're still a long way to go, but which is still good. Then if you look at the other type of projects which have been coming, it is like where you have the waste energy, which Dubai is now putting up one of the largest waste energy facility in the world. 5,000 tons per day waste incineration. So we should take almost about 80% of the waste generated MSW can be spent there. But of course, there are also a lot of private entities who come in with sorting lines. So like that, different companies are coming, but everywhere the challenge is how do you make it? How do you make these companies sustainable? That is where the revenue streams, the circular economy has to also churn and make sure that the wheels are running continuously. In other ways, it would be just a start and stop sort of an operation. People will come in enthusiastically, do something, then they'll get stuck in the way. This is where the policies, the guidelines are coming in. But we have been having a lot of discussions from the private sector with the ministry. We were trying to give our views, and we have seen a lot of positive responses, like what Raj is saying, because we have been handling a lot of these hazardous. Now you can imagine, it used to be quite funny because I'm able to export hazardous waste from, let's say, UAE to Germany for treatment. For example, there's no facility yet, the Basel Convention norms and the entire documentation. Whereas I could never move the waste, let's say, from one emirate to the other emirate because there was no centralized policy. It's like, so this is where, for example, the waste generated in Abu Dhabi, which would have a lot of calorific value, could be used in Fujairah in those cement plants. But they were having a challenge because it had 3 emirates. Each emirate had their own regulations in terms of permitting and all this. So it used to be a big problem, but those things are being streamlined to allow these waste to move. Similarly, you also have like what we have been now talking about. What we are trying to do now is we have another facility recently we commissioned, where we're converting the paper, waste paper which we're collecting, into molded recyclables, making like food waste or tea pots, medical disposables. That has come in stream, and we are in discussions with again. But again, problem would be when I do these sort of things, wait, my cost will be different compared to what you import from China with some cheaper plastic. So you need to have a level playing field. This is what we were discussing in terms of how the government can support. These are things which are, and again for just to inform Peter's knowledge, we have also just now recently set up the Marco approved complete oil electric sludge injection, which will ensure that all the marine waste are recycled by proper at plants also. So from the private sector today, there are a lot of initiatives which are coming. There is also that support element which is there from the government to see how they can take it forward, and the dialogue is continuing to see that okay, we make it all these units sustainable, and it is not just flash in the pan here and there. Some people trying to sell it.
When you say 20%, now you've reached a 20% collection of recyclables. Out of this 20%, how much could we enter the production or manufacturing here?
This entire, because see, for example, when I'm talking about 20%, I'm talking about from the sorted, pre-sorted, because that is another challenge which this part of the world suffers. So when everybody is talking about technology, unfortunately, what they try to do is just cut and paste what's happening in Europe and Dubai. It doesn't work, because when I'm bringing a sorting line or when I'm doing some sort of a processing system and I implement it here, it's not my ground reality is not the same, because in Europe you have 4, 5, 6 bins. Every specific product already the people are aware. And here we are talking about 140 nationalities and a very a population which keeps changing every every year or every 2 years. So it's a huge task, and for each of them, recycling itself is a completely different perception depending upon from which part of the world they're coming. So that's another challenge. So when I'm talking about this 20%, it is 20% of the European general MSW which you throw into that contains of that, let us say that is 100 kgs. That will contain, let us say, 45 or 50 kgs of recycling. Out of that 50 kgs of recyclables, only 20%. That means about 10 kgs is what is I'm able to recover. Still, there is another 40 kgs. So this is the type of, and this is pure, and this goes into the recycling stream, 100%. Like for example, it's aluminium, or it is plastic, or PET, or HDPE, or LD. It goes like that's what it's.
I see that there was a question here from one of the attendees.
Thank you. So I was going to ask, I think for me, it's education. But basically, you said about all different nationalities in this country. I live in Sweden some of the time. They only empty my bin once every 2 weeks. And I have to pay for that. It's quite a lot of money to get that bin emptied every 2 weeks. Here I get your guys around every single, I go out for my run at 6 o'clock and they're emptying my bins every morning, 7 days a week. So, that's got to stop, because otherwise we're just going to get lazy. And I think also imposing taxes on certain items such as tins, plastic bottles, etc. Everything is put back into a machine and you get your money back, but you'll pay the tax on it. And I don't know what's happened to plastic bags, because I'm still being given plastic bags in supermarkets. I thought they were a thing of the past, but they seem to be still around. And some people charge them, some people don't. But for me, it's right back to this education thing. We've got to have a drive at government level to stop people assuming they can just throw things away. They've got to start thinking about that in a bigger way. And I think, just through COVID and everything else that's happened recently, I think everyone is ready to start doing something for the planet together. So I think that's the key thing for me is let's get people thinking about sustainability, not just you guys having to sort of deal with it afterwards.
Just to highlight a little bit on this plastic bags, Of course, yes, there's a huge plastic bag here. But what has happened is 2013, the government here has come up with a norm. All these shopping bags have to be OXO bagging. What has happened is that today, so that when it is thrown into the landfill, it degrades there and it doesn't remain there. That's happening. So of course, it has to be changed to paper or any of the other type of biodegradable products. That will take time. At least that extent, there has been a legislation, and if you get all the bags, you will find a seal which says it's OXO.
Thank you. And I think there's a big dietary barrier with bags with steel, because at the end of the day, yes, they go to landfill, maybe they break down in a certain way, but if they are dispersed in the environment, they end up being plastic, very thin plastic particles. Related to plastic bags, I just wanted to mention that we all received a survey some days ago by the Dubai government asking the population what we think about plastic bags. So this makes us think that something is cooking somewhere. So I can see Jamila nodding, but it's in the pot. So let's see, maybe in a few weeks we'll receive something. But Peter, you had a...
Yeah, I just wanted to raise this issue. You know, again, we focused very much on UAE and policy and taxes and what the government should do with it. And let me just quickly talk about the ultimate waste product right now, which is carbon, okay? Now, I think most of us recognize that carbon capture and storage are going to be a must if we're going to get anywhere close to our climate change going forward, right? Now, to do that will require a price of carbon, rather like we've just been talking about a price of waste. It doesn't exist now, all right? There is no price that exists for removing carbon. And at the end of the day, we're going to have to invent that. Now, this then comes to the issue of saying, is this this comes back to the title of my presentation, Self versus Society. Is this a national issue or a global issue? And if it's a global issue, how do we go about tackling it? So let me just talk about carbon, and then we'll maybe talk very quickly about how that links into waste. But there was a guy called Professor Pigou, you know, about 80 years ago at Cambridge University, who said what we want is a single price of carbon for the world, right? And that is what we should be all working to in order to create an efficient market. You have a price that you charge for carbon. I would argue that he's completely wrong. That actually what you need to do is to look at waste and carbon on a value chain by value chain basis, which comes back to ecosystems again. So for example, is it right that the oil and gas business, and I'm now talking about the UAE or anywhere else that is producing gas, to be able to effectively call their LNG or their gas green by effectively offsetting it, growing trees in Brazil, as opposed to investing in carbon capture and storage for their own value chain? I would argue that what we need is a world that identifies these value chain ecosystems and comes up with a system to actually minimize waste, including carbon, on a value chain by value chain basis. Which means actually, back to my comment about the 50 shades of green for climate change, there is no such thing as a green policy. There is only a policy about how we clean up the hydrocarbons business, how we clean up the power business, how we clean up the mobility business. And that's what we haven't done. So I would argue this conversation we've just had now will go some way to waste minimization within value chains that we've created in the past. What we need to do is step away from looking at the value chains of the past and create fundamentally new value chains on which to manage the future. And I believe that is realistically possible in a world that is looking at issues such as the circular economy in a different way. So that might sound very grand, but I think that's where I have a slight difference of opinion in terms of the conversation we've just had now about plastic bags and dealing with things at a local level. from actually coming up with solutions that are more regional and global in nature, that take into account the international finance system, banking, and everything else. So in my opinion, it's not up to individual countries necessarily to cure these problems by themselves. It's up to the global community and society at large.
Thanks, Peter. I completely agree with you on nearly everything said, except for forgetting about history. And for me, the one price per carbon is similar to the question of, do we have one price for bread globally? And directly what jumps to mind is the social impact, right? Is it fair to make somebody in Africa or Asia or, I mean, somebody with very little history of emissions pay the same carbon price per ton than somebody who's in a country that's been emitting for centuries, right? So that's the past should count, which is why the Paris Agreement has Annex A, Annex 1 countries and non-Annex countries. So I'd probably take your framework of I said you said value chains, I think, so the sectors, but also add a layer of history and region. And I think when we're not in the state to think about carbon taxing, but when we work on sustainability policy, I work at the local level, so it's really at the bottom of the chain in terms of policy making. But whenever we think of what can we do, something like EPR policies, right, extended producer responsibility policies, whether it's for the packaging industry or carbon taxes or whatever it is, usually is you can't do much at a local level. It has to be at a federal level, and really at a federal level in the GCC region, for example, it won't be meaningful unless you have the entire GCC buying into it, just like the ETS scheme of Europe, right? And so I think the main point that I completely agree with you is on the complexity of implementing this, and it needs to take into consideration regional specificities, sectors, and also social.
Yeah, just to add to what Jamila was saying in terms of this carbon, especially the carbon credit system, what has been happening globally. Just to talk with respect to the local context, because when there is a company here which tried to do a lot of work landfill gas management, and they are producing by landfill energy, electricity. And then, of course, trying to show how much of greenhouse gas saving. Try to get a carbon credit, and the whole project was based on a certain value for the carbon, what they could get. Because you have to understand that there are no subsidies, there are no support. Other side, a lot of subsidies done. So they had worked on a financial model, which talked, and then when I think they signed an agreement with Norway or something like that. And but it was at a certain level. But today, the carbon values have dropped so drastically low that project viability just based on these type of, trusting this global carbon credit policies would never sustain, because it needs to be having some sort of local vision also to see that how we can get integrated and maybe a better value chain as from that perspective, whatever Peter was suggesting is much better. For example, if I go to global greenhouse or the carbon level or the climate change objectives are the same, and in terms of the rise in temperatures, how much you need to control. So on that basis, if every country looks at taking responsibility and says, okay, like for example, in UAE we are generating a lot of emissions from the hydrocarbon. But I may not be able to grow trees here because of the local, because if I'm going to grow trees here, I'm going to spend more money to produce the water. So I might as well go and do it in Brazil or in an African country where they've been deforesting the places everywhere. So that's the way, and this is exactly what is happening. It is something similar to, for example, let us say, the barter system for electricity. Now, DEWA, at this point of time, like I can put a solar and on my, or whatever it is, generate some power and give it back to DEWA, and they're giving us a rebate or a barter. So something like that should be looked at it even for the carbon and for the emission. That's it. That's the only way I think this can get resolved.
Thank you, Jamil. Very interesting. Is anyone in the room with any question? I see there are a lot of familiar faces. Yes, Yasin.
Thank you. I have just a general question that I think is on a topic that you touched upon before, which is wastewater. I'm in agriculture, and one of the things that I see as a trend is that agriculture should move into cities to reduce transportation. There's a lot of limitations to that, and one of the things that for the UAE I'm always wondering about is the wastewater treatment. You know, you mentioned in Singapore you are using it completely for human consumption. So here that might be a difficult task. So I'm wondering why we can't use it for agriculture. And if we're going to use it for agriculture, it can go into animal feed. So that's not producing food first, it's producing grasses, using systems like that can purify the water, help purify the water, and then produce animal feed for cattle. And this type of systems means that I need to look at the farms where the energy production is, or where the wastewater production is, away from the cities, where you can have kind of system all together. You still need to transport into the city, but I feel like these types of industries shouldn't really be in the city. And also, if it's a huge factory or manufacturing, whether energy or water, then a lot of the secondary outputs could be used in agriculture, for example, in that same area. I'm wondering if there's anything happening about wastewater recirculation.
Based on the infractions which having municipality, I'm aware of the municipality sewage treatment. Everyone 10,000. Now, whatever is water which is, but it's actually going in for irrigation. But all the greenery which is going on is generated from. Now, at this point of time, they're also putting up a tax sewage sludge, a sort of biogas project is on. What happens is the digestion is some sort of that. They gain a fertilizer. There are definitely some sort of progressive process that way, but it's not in the open. Talks about it, so it's happening.
Also, to depend too much on treated water is a bit of a danger. For example, here in Dubai, in the summer, when the whole population leaves for the holidays, municipality faces shortage, and lots of areas in the outskirts of the central Dubai are cut from water for maybe 2-3 days. So when we plant our own trees and we come back from the summer, some of the trees are dead because they didn't get water in 2 weeks. And we can't do anything. Municipality just doesn't have that water. So here we're looking at the UAE growing into a 20 million people population in the future. The more we will be, the more water we'll consume. So it's a circle. Hopefully the water stays in, but the moment something happens, like for example COVID, suddenly everyone stayed here, and last summer there was plenty of water to irrigate. But this summer, what will happen? So it's also very hard, and we depend here a lot on the sea. Unless you have new technologies such as source, these solar panels that produce water out of the air, and that is revolutionary, because at the end of the day, you'll be able to give you water anywhere you are, very far from the city. But when we talk about bringing huge farms into the city, it's also because I think we also want the energy output to be nearer to the city. And here in Dubai, we can see how the desalination plants and all this are just at the back of JBR and all this, not so far. But around those areas, it's bare desert. And we could have all those areas instead be green with farms and animals. So I think here it's a matter of urban planning. My feeling is there's not been a plan since the beginning, and now it's adjusting the necessity, but still be interesting when we look at the 2040 plan on having a very green Dubai, that this greenery is not only planting trees and having nice to have parks. The greenery could be farmers coming in and bringing, you know, a different kind of greenery that has a purpose, I think.
Just to, especially take UAE, sure you know that we are one of the highest consumers per capita, 160 liters per person, higher than even the entire quantity of water is desalination. And another interesting statistics, if you look at the desal plants globally, 75% of the entire desalination plant in the whole world is being around this question. What is happening is that you are taking the seawater for salinity, putting the concentrated back to the sea. The salinity of that water is going up, and I'm aware that you know, we're going to put salinity back in. But the salinity at that time was this Persian Gulf was around 400 parts per million. As against go to the Arabian Sea 750. So almost 50% more brackish saline is water which you have. That's why you don't find any fish now. You need to go very much into the deep sea. So that's also a challenge. So what's happening is that is affecting your groundwater or entire groundwater. So it's actually like what you rightly said. This was a discussion which I've had even in Turkey. Because this is a very fragile ecology. We need to look at, and whatever is being done is artificial system. So we need to look at where do we cap it. See that just strain on these resources. Already it's a strained resource, water. And when you start adding more and more population into the system, it's going to make it still good. There is no other source, there's no groundwater resource like not depend on. So this is a very, it's quite a, you know, this is where a lot of has to come in and see how do we cap it and also make sure that the development is there in the whole region.
Yeah, I just want to add something on the location of such facilities for infrastructure. It has a lot to do with the city. So at a certain point in time, we think that this is the boundary of the city of where it should go. So we put that there, and then as the city expands, you may see the need to move them later, such as the port relocation projects. And we see these things a lot happen in many cities, but they are very, very costly. They cost billions. So I think there should be two systems. One is like a centralized system where the larger facilities at the outskirts and all put together, and then we have a small decentralized system where we have smaller units in the city. The bigger problem here, I think, is that everybody sees them as a disconnection from the city, ugly facilities, polluting sometimes. There are ways to deal with that in terms of design. But right now, I think there's one potential, something that came out of both innovation and circular economy, which is modular construction. So we're moving towards building facilities with a modular way that can be dismantled and relocated somewhere else if there's a need to move them and take them. And that gives a lot of potential for everything that we're talking about right now, which is sometimes we change our mind to move to a circular way of thinking. So how do we deal with that? We build new construction where we can dismantle and take it into whatever facility. So it keeps us evolving in an easier way. So.
Peter, I'm conscious that we've been connected for 2 hours, and it's gone really beyond the time. And thank you so much for your time and to everyone here and online. So I'm going to wrap it up here. I will thank everyone. Thank you, Trevor, for organizing this. It was really, really precious to have this event set up. Thank you very much, Peter, for your patience as well and keeping up with us and our problems with technology. So thank you for that. And thank you for a really great presentation. And I can see some people asked if you could share it. But anyway, this whole 2 hours talk is recorded. So if someone wants to go through again, the presentation will be in the recording. And thank you, of course, to our panelists. We might stay here 5 minutes more in case anyone has questions here in the room. But anyway, thank you again to everyone. It's been a pleasure, and hopefully we'll do it again.
Thanks to Tanya too and your team for putting all the technology bits together. I know we had a bit of a difficult time at the beginning, but thank you to everyone for staying on. I think it just shows the passion of the people in the room and on Zoom as well. So thanks for joining, and I'm sure we'll have another one of these on a different topic in the near future. So bye to everyone, and thank you very much for Peter. I know it's 11 o'clock, 11 p.m. So great, thank you, Peter, and we look forward to talking to you again. Good night.